The unilateral appropriation of Russia's assets is equally unlawful, unacceptable, and a derogation from the UN Charter.
During the opening session of the Ukraine Peace Summit that was held in Switzerland on June 15, 2024, the Kenyan President William Ruto shocked the world by differing with the West's current stand on frozen Russian assets, and the decision by G7 leaders to appropriate the Russian assets to raise $50 billion for Ukraine, in a bid to help it equip its military and face the Russian troops. William Ruto, who was the first to be handed the opportunity to speak at the summit once the floor was opened to the 101 heads of states and government representatives present, more took a middle stand over the conflict, where he first condemned Russia for violating the United Nations Charter to invade a sovereign state. He then appreciated the organization of the Peace Summit, saying that it's a new step towards resolving of the conflict, and as such demanded that ultimately, Russia, which was absent, will have to be on the table in such a peace summit in the future, for peace to be realized. And then with a bold face, he faulted the West, or rather G7 leaders, for the deal that was signed on June 14, 2024, on the sidelines of the summit in Italy, in which it was agreed by the G7 leaders to use frozen Russian assets to raise $50 billion for Ukraine to help it fight Russian forces. With the same being an agreement which US President Joe Biden said that it was another reminder to Russia that the West is not backing down, and to which President Vladimir Putin said it was theft, which would not go unpunished. According to the Kenyan president, an eye for an eye would make a world blind, and the appropriation of Russian assets by the West is unjust and unlawful, and the G7 leaders were wrong to draft the agreement to use the Russian assets to raise funds for Ukraine, and without saying much, take a listen at him make the submission here.
I am now pleased to invite the President of Kenya, William Ruto, to give his intervention.
The President of Switzerland, the President Zelensky of Ukraine, Madam Vice President of the United States, heads of states, ladies and gentlemen, 79 years after the international community established a multilateral institutional framework to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a horrifying spectacle of carnage and devastation, which has left 500,000 people dead and 7.1 million people displaced in its wake. Across the world, people and nations are enduring the negative consequences of disrupted supply chains. Kenya's position has been clear and unequivocal from the beginning. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is unlawful, unjust, and a violation of the fundamental principles of international law, which honor the sovereign equality of nations, upholds their territorial integrity, and advocates the peaceful resolution of all disagreements. Just like the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East has been equally devastating. So is the case with the war in the Sahel region in Africa, in Eastern DRC, in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, and of course in the Sudan. 14 million Africans have been displaced by the war in our continent, and 2.5 million kids are out of school. This state of affairs speaks volumes of global leadership, and especially the peace architecture at the United Nations, and more specifically the gridlock at the United Nations Security Council. Today, a farmer in Kenya, in rural Kenya actually, knows there is war in Ukraine for two reasons. Number one, he paid more for his fertilizer, and number two, his fertilizer came late. Let me also say, this peace summit is a historic step in the right direction. For the first time, we have convened to talk about peace in Ukraine and not war in Ukraine. Secondly, a commitment to peace makes certain fundamental concessions inevitable. This summit should not be a meeting of just friends. This should be a meeting of both friends and foe. To succeed in this positive trajectory, Russia must be on the table, number one. Number two, an American general, Norman Swartzwelder, said, the more we sweat in peace, the less we bleed in war. It is time for leaders of the world to talk about peace, negotiate peace, work hard to build peace, and configure a global strategic framework that integrates peace as the sole means and end of human endeavor. Finally, we have gathered here and we are reminded by the Indian statesman Mahatma Gandhi, who said that an eye for an eye will make humanity blind. Just as Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unlawful and unacceptable, the unilateral appropriation of Russia's assets is equally unlawful, unacceptable, and a derogation from the UN Charter, especially for those of us who believe in freedom, justice, and democracy, and the rule of law. As we embark on this journey to resolve conflict in Ukraine and throughout the world, it's time for parties to the war in Ukraine to demonstrate good faith, abandon intransigent attitudes, and soften their positions. I thank you.
Thank you.